Welcome to PaleyIMPACT, part of Paley at Home, presented by Citi. I'm Danielle Belton, Editor-in-Chief of The Root. The Paley Center is dedicated to celebrating excellence in media, especially now. To help them continue to bring you outstanding programs like this one, please go to paleycenter.org to donate. In today's panel, Uniting Brands and Networks for Change, we will discuss how major brands and content makers are leading the effort to fight against social inequality and fight for social justice, economic empowerment, and civil rights through their messaging and content. I am joined by Scott Mills, President of BET Networks, Kim Godwin, Executive Vice President at CBS News, Derrick Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP, Damon Jones, Chief Communication Officer of Procter & Gamble, and Dennis Williams, Senior Vice President, Corporate Affairs and Social Responsibility at WarnerMedia. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, and before we get started, I'd like to thank our friends at BET for their support in making this important program possible. And speaking of BET, my first question is for Scott. Would you please begin by telling us about the Content for Change initiative, how it began, and what its goals are?
Content for Change was born of our focus on the role that BET could play to help drive material change to address the issues that we're all confronting today. And we really believe that whether it's the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 or the incidences of lethal racism that we've seen play out over the last several months, that all of this is anchored in kind of systemic racism that exists in this country. And the question was, can BET play a role to help combat systemic racism? And we focused on the idea that we know that media is massively influential in creating beliefs and perceptions and narratives and representations. And that over time, people have looked to kind of mitigate the harmful utilization of media, but people haven't focused on the proactive, positive utilization of media and messaging to impact perceptions. And so we created Content for Change anchored in this idea that it's not just eliminating the harmful representations and narratives, but it's actually about working with scholars and academics to identify what narratives, representations, and stories can be shared across communities that can actually get to the underlying drivers of racism.
It sounds like extremely important work, especially given the times that we're living in right now, which takes me to our second question, which is for all the panel. Where were you and what were you thinking when you first saw the George Floyd video?
Well, I'll start. I was watching CBS this morning and watching it play out on our show. And Gayle King was anchoring, and she had a moment there where she felt the weight of the Ahmaud Arbery story, Breonna Taylor story. On This Morning, it was the George Floyd video, followed by the Central Park birdwatcher video. And she just had a moment where she just had to stop. She felt the weight of it as a Black woman, as a mother, and she voiced that. And I was feeling the exact same way. Like it was this confluence of events that, oh my goodness, what is happening? And that video, because it played, you know, in real time, unfiltered, you saw it for yourself. You could watch the entire 8 minutes plus. There was a weight there that knew that there was something different about this moment, and this story deserved a spotlight put on it, and many questions needed to be asked. So that was the beginning of it for me.
For me, it took me several days. I mean, you had, saw about it on Twitter, heard about it on the radio, but just with so many of these events that have happened over the recent years, it took me a few days to just get up the muster to in fact watch the video and to watch all 8 minutes of it. You know, you'd seen the still shots of it. And it was, you know, one early morning, probably about 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And it just spoke to, I think, just the repeated trauma of having to see Black bodies endure pain and endure death, to just get the courage to do that. And, you know, I didn't go back to sleep for a while after doing that. But I've got nephews, 3 of them, right? And the 2 youngest ones are not in school and they're jogging like Ahmaud Arbery was. So I think what we're seeing in these moments is that these are not just moments where you're watching other people like you watch a TV show, right? I mean, these are people that you can relate to. And I think that's what makes the images and the sounds and the videos so powerful, because it could have been me.
Definitely. Derrick?
You know, I was home quarantined like most of America at this moment, and I started getting urgent calls and texts from our Minneapolis branch president. And then I got a call from our communications department to talk about a video that I needed to watch immediately on social media. And in watching that video, I was both shocked and appalled. And that's before I realized he actually had died. I'm watching this thing, and 5 minutes into it, I'm like, what are they doing? Why are they holding him down? Only to watch it and get on the call with our local branch president. And she said, you know, they killed him. And she was frantic. The next morning, I also watched CBS News and looking at Gayle King's emotional response. It was heartfelt, because I am a father of sons. I am a Black male in America. And this was a part of several emotional moments, from being in the midst of a health pandemic, us realizing that African Americans are desperately impacted, me being from Detroit, recognizing that many people that I knew in Detroit have been adversely affected, only to this to happen in a backdrop of Ahmaud Arbery and what we were doing there. And this hit us, and this came after the realization what happened in Louisville, Kentucky with Breonna Taylor. And then, so we are in the midst of a health pandemic, in the midst of structural racism that has plagued this decade for years, and now captured full-length video, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the murder of an African-American male in the middle of the street, broad daylight, over $20.
Scott?
I was at home. I have 9-year-old boy-girl twins. And I really had to step away and find a place to watch it, because I really didn't want my 9-year-olds to understand that this is the way, the Black reality in America. And I wanted to do what Damon did, which is to say, I really wanted to take a moment to process it in segments, because it was excruciating to endure the entire thing. But I really felt that, given the role that we play at BET and the way that BET had to mobilize a response, and the way the entire organization was working to mobilize a response, that it was my responsibility to experience exactly what our entire community witnessed. It was stunning to then kind of re-engage with my children after having to watch the way, you know, Black people get treated in this country.
Dennis, did you have thoughts as well?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously echo a lot of what was said. It seems like we're all fans of the CBS morning show, because we watch it every morning in my house as well. So that was where I first heard the news, and like Scott and others, I have a 6-year-old son who's usually in the room with me as we're watching the news, and I'll try to explain various news stories that sort of come into his ear. And on this one, I was really disturbed. I actually asked him not to look at the screen. I sort of knew what was about to happen and what was about to unfold. I also lived in the Twin Cities from 1990 until 1994. And so the scene was familiar to me. Like, I've been to South Minneapolis many, many times. And so it felt very, very personal. And then, you know, as the story continued to unfold, my thoughts, you know, as a relatively new parent, you know, continue to go back to my own son. I thought about, you know, this oversized 6-year-old that I have. Everyone thinks that he's 8 or 9 years old because he's so tall. And I thought, you know, when he's moving through the world like George Floyd, and they call him a gentle giant, like, is this the reality that he will experience? Will people automatically see his size, his color, his presence as a threat? And And is it possible that he would meet this sort of same fate? And so for me, I thought a lot about my kid.
Completely understandable. I have an 8-year-old nephew, and those thoughts also flashed through my mind. I waited probably a week before I could actually bring myself to watch it after reading all the different accounts. And so I completely understand where everyone's coming from here. It was a powerful video, but it was a horrifying video to witness. And it encapsulated so much about what's wrong with policing in our country, and the fact that our children and our brothers and our sisters are not seen as human beings. Essentially, their humanity is not seen. And so my second question, which is for the entire panel as well, what was your brand or company's response to that same video and the public outcry?
I'll start again from the news perspective. We are documenting history in real time in news. I mean, even right now, I'm sort of one eye and ear on the John Lewis coverage, right? So it's happening in real time, and there is a tremendous weight and responsibility in that, knowing the impact and importance of everything that we report every day, every time we're on the air. So when you talk about, content for change and change, I think our biggest responsibility was to make sure that we are giving voice to the communities that are often voiceless or not heard or underrepresented. And you talk about being in the right place and time in history. I sort of felt that in this moment, because being an African-American woman and being charged with the editorial oversight of our news gathering coverage, that put me in a unique position to make sure that voices were being heard. And often where, many of us are tempered, and I will say I'm tempered about, race and culture and being sensitive to that, because you don't want to be accused of playing the race card or, that kind of thing. In this case, I leaned right into this. And I was very honest about everything I was feeling, my colleagues were feeling, as we talked about how we covered these things. I would lean into it. And there were mornings when I was, sort of emotional, said, hey, my niece called me this morning and she's in the Army and wanted to know, I signed up for 7 years for a country that doesn't care about me. That's the way I woke up this morning. So let's continue to talk. I just leaned into it, just talked about, everything that I was feeling and things that my colleagues were talking about and feeling as well. So as a news organization, that was really important, that around the editorial table, we gave voice to it and allowed people to talk, not just me, but anybody who wanted to and experience those kinds of things. And then all of our news programming. I mean, if you just look at CBS This Morning and CBS Evening News, we talk to 10 million people on broadcast alone, but we have radio, we have digital, we have social media, all of our platforms leaned into this topic, and across the board, 60 Minutes, 48 Hours, Face the Nation, Sunday Morning, Satmo, all of our programs for weeks on end, this was the focus. And we allowed, as many stories to be told as we could find, as many voices as we could find. As was mentioned already, it wasn't just the George Floyd video, but it was the confluence, all of the videos and events that led up to that, and the pandemic. And all of this was affecting Black and Brown communities. And so it was important that we give voice to all of that. All of our shows leaned into it. And we had several collaborations with BET. We did a COVID special. We did Justice for All, Gayle King, a 1-hour network special. We did Pandemia, which focused on Latinos in crisis on our digital streaming network. Any idea that we could think of, any collaborations that we could make, we did. And I'll let Derrick talk about it, but even our CEO, George Cheeks, we started to collaborate with the NAACP on our overall content on CBS. And it's not just, hey, let's have a meeting and talk about how we change, but we're actually putting money there and saying 25% of our budget is going to go toward that kind of content and collaborative information. So, as an organization, I think CBS and CBS News, we are really leaning into this and looking for ways to give voice to this time in history.
And I'll pick up from there. For the NAACP, because we are an on-the-ground organizations with members and volunteers in all the affected areas, we were in the midst of pushing information to authorities to deal with Ahmaud Arbery. Our local branch president and our state president really hit the ground running. And we have began to, prior to this year, replenish our leadership with younger activists on the ground who can really navigate social media. And so in Georgia, he was on top of everything. And he has a close relationship with our Minneapolis branch president, a 28-year-old lawyer who's as enthusiastic as you can find, who was in the streets immediately, and the level of emotion that both of them just shared. And, it went to a training that we had already begun to do to talk about the moments for leadership. And leadership should never be based on egocentric personality, big voice. It is about the collective wholes and people on the ground, because that is how information get transmitted. And in that moment, I can see these young people really emerge in their own leadership space in their shoes and begin to push forward not only information, but their colleagues around a narrative consistent with justice. How can we call ourselves a just society when people can be murdered in broad daylight? A just society when an elected district attorney refused to prosecute individuals who pursued a vigilante killing in Georgia? A just society when the murderers of Breonna Taylor are still on the police force and nothing has been done. And in the midst of this, we cannot forget Amy Cooper in Central Park. We cannot be a just society if the tool that white women have used throughout history, whether it's the Scottsboro boys in Alabama in the 30s or Emmett Till in the 50s, if we allow these type of narratives to go unchecked, if we allow individuals to commit heinous act with impunity and not be held accountable. And for the NAACP, we are in that moment where we have to, and I've been in this seat for 3 years, really put forth a different approach of how we address civil rights. Difference in terms of our tactics, but the same in terms of our mission, 111 years old, because movements and communities, and we're celebrating the legacy of John Lewis, is based on narratives. John Lewis was 14 years old when he seen the Twitter of the day in 1955 called Jet Magazine, the photo of that casket of Emmett Till being displayed. That ignited something in him and ignited something into all of the youth activists of the day. It is our role to make sure we control our narrative so that people can understand their responsibility to create the just society that's proclaimed but not realized for African Americans.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a moment where, we all have to look and say, what can we do, where we're at to advance this discussion. For many years, P&G's been using, our voice and our position as the world's leading advertiser to really shine a light on bias and inequality that exists and make sure that we're doing what we talked about at the top of the program to put forward, positive, accurate, and realistic portrayals of all people, but most notably Black men. In 2019, long before George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery were in the news, we created a film called The Look. And The Look told the story of the everyday bias and those small but cumulative moments that Black men face as they're going throughout their day. And it was interesting to begin this moment to look back over The Look, much like we did another film called The Talk a few years ago. And when we launched some of these films, people told us that we were race baiting, that we were being more divisive, that we were making a big to-do about nothing. But now, I think many people have really woken up and realized that the images that we do put out into the world really matter. They shape how communities see themselves. They shape how communities see each other. And you can just think about, what did those people think about when they simply looked at George Floyd, knowing nothing about him, knowing nothing of the story? What did they think about Ahmaud when they knew nothing about him, when they knew nothing about his story? We hear all of these tropes. Well, it's about education. It's about all of these other things. Breonna Taylor's education didn't matter when those cops bust through that door that night, right? So I'm not discounting any of those other programs, or those other, points, but this is a moment in time where we have to realize that everyone plays a role, whether you're a brand in corporate America and what you do with your advertising voice and your employees, whether you're a news organization or whether you're a network. This is something where we all have to come together and say, if it's something little or if it's something big, we cannot let this moment pass without doing something dramatically different. And that's what we're trying to do and step up now.
That's exactly right. And we're at BET gigantic fans of the work that P&G is doing and the work that the NAACP is doing, and we're collaborating with them. Our response was to really understand our role given our position in the community. So first we had to inform. So we had to really deliver a robust, informative news and insights platform in partnership with Kim and our colleagues at CBS to really get to the underlying issues. The second is we absolutely had to create an opportunity for our community to grieve. We had to support the nationwide grieving and emotional release that our community needed. And we understood that how important that was. Ultimately, we said we have to live up to our mission to empower our community. And that meant that we have to work hard to identify how we can actually get to contributing solutions to the underlying issues. And in partnership with organizations like Procter & Gamble and the NAACP, we really have focused on what are the underlying issues. At the risk of saying this, police officers and police forces are not intrinsically bad, right? The core issue in this country is systemic racism. And we deliver images and messages and narratives and beliefs to everyone in this country at a very early age in their lives, and it just accumulates. And the way that lands on people is it creates some distribution of racism, right? And then those people go forth into the world and they normally populate all of these different roles. Some of them are CEOs of publicly traded companies. Some of them are police officers. Some of them are doctors, right? And on and on and on. And having people in critical roles in our society who have been effectively infected by the pernicious racist messages that our country has so kind of dearly held on to is what is causing so much of these challenges that exist in our community. And so our focus is how do we at BET, recognizing with this insight, how do we partner with companies like P&G, organizations like the NAACP, also our colleagues at Viacom CBS, because this isn't solely about speaking to African Americans, this is about speaking to everyone in this country. And how do we address those underlying issues? And so that's been our response to this.
Yeah, I would say at WarnerMedia, our first response was an internal one, where we sort of had to think about what our employees were experiencing. And so we really swiftly reached out to our employee resource groups and others in the organization, created opportunities in particular for African-American colleagues to process this. We brought in therapists, in fact, because we recognized that this was the kind of trauma. There was an article that we shared, and I can't remember the author, but the title was, your Black colleagues are not okay, right? That we were not processing or able to process the PowerPoint that's due at the end of the day at the same time that we're thinking about the lives of our brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles being extinguished on the street. And so we had a very rapid and strong response internally. To Scott's point, we also recognize that this was a larger conversation than just one that Black people needed to have. And I think this is sort of the catalytic moment in our time right now. We did a town hall. We brought in the author, Robin DiAngelo, to talk about white fragility and talk to our white colleagues about the role that they have played in perpetuating racism in the society. And then that sort of culminated in a very bold statement that we were happy for our CEO to make. I don't know if our lawyers were as happy, but Jason sort of openly acknowledging that we have a problem with racism at WarnerMedia. And the reason we have a problem with racism at WarnerMedia is because WarnerMedia is a company that exists in the United States of America. And we cannot act as if we are an island and that we have somehow fixed racism or that we have understood diversity if we exist in the context of these United States where systemic racism surrounds us every single day. And so I think, you know, the culmination of those activities has really kind of pushed us and propelled us into some really healthy places. It's the first time that I've seen, for example, you know, a conservative media company, if you want to call us that, embrace the Black Lives Matter movement. Up until this point, I mean, I know a lot of people are doing it now, but we should really ask ourselves, what was the reluctance before George Floyd's death for companies like ours to embrace that? And what did it say? What did it illustrate about what we thought, who we thought we were? Externally, we asked ourselves a little bit like what Derrick was saying, you know, we've long supported nonprofit organizations, social justice organizations. We've written the check, but somehow writing the check just didn't feel like it was enough. It certainly wasn't effective anymore. So we had to ask ourselves, not what are we doing, but what aren't we doing? What more could we be doing? And where we landed, I think, is a really interesting place. And that is, we took inventory of what our most valuable resource is across our broadcast networks. And that's our commercial space. That's what we sell to advertisers. That's where the dollars come in the door. And so we created a partnership with a group of nonprofit organizations to help amplify their social justice messages on our platform through our public service announcement space, through our PSA space. So in the same way that we're able to run a spot from the Center for Disease Control around COVID and washing our hands and social distancing, we should be able to run those same kinds of messages around social justice and social activism without flinching or without batting an eye. And so you'll see that in the coming months on WarnerMedia as we begin to push that content out. It's how the narrative gets changed. As Scott said, our platforms reach millions and millions of viewers. And if we craft the right message, then that message gets internalized and we can begin to see the change that we want to see.
Yeah. So if I jump in here, so I do also recall the moment Scott and I start talking about the concept of content for change, you know, because NAACP had the partnership with BET, Viacom, our Image Awards. For us, it became really crucial because our second most important campaign we took on from our founding was an advocacy campaign against a new movie called Birth of a Nation that was being released in 1915. We recognized how this movie could impact the trajectory of African Americans' quality of life in this nation. And by 1930, as a result of this movie, there were more members of the Klan in states like Indiana and Michigan than there were in states like Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. How people see us on the screen is how they treat us in the street. So when Scott shared with me Procter & Gamble's The Look video, I was like, this is powerful. And it also began to allow us to envision something bigger and much more substantive, which led us to the conversation with George Cheeks and CBS around what role can we play in content creation? If we want the democracy to be what it should be for our communities, we must inform how people consume information. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person during his time because he recognized that period of time, more people in this nation was illiterate, black and white, anything else. So public policy was being conveyed through cartoon characters in the newspaper. So he would take photographs of himself because the depictions of African Americans were shiftless, lazy, with elongated features, and he wanted to portray a dignified, educated black man. That is the charge for media. That is the charge for advertisers. How are we portraying ourselves on the media? Women who are well qualified and sharp and executives, men who stand with integrity, young people who are curious and forge into the future. Because if we don't use this moment to look forward, we're gonna use this moment to pause, give glossy statements, and then go back to the same reality that we found ourselves in last year.
I just want to pick up on that, Derrick, because it's really important from the news standpoint, because we are on all the time and the visuals matter. and how we cover things matter. So, you know, not only looking at, you know, giving voice to the voiceless, right, and shining a spotlight on the disparities of Black and brown communities as far as COVID and police brutality, et cetera, but also to flip that. And so many of the doctors that are treating COVID patients are of color as well, and making sure that they are some of the voices. We're not just the people in the hospital beds. We are the people treating, and we are the people in labs trying to come up with the vaccine. Being aware of every image that we and every voice that we choose on news and the impact of that, and you know, just focusing on that we can't always be just the victims, because we're not. We are many times part of the solution, and we have to find those people and give those people voices as well.
Thank you. So I'm glad that Kim and Derrick, you guys kind of pivoted this direction, because it leads into my next question, which I want to start with Derrick about, which is, what are brands and news organizations doing right in this moment of crisis, and where are there room for improvement?
I pulled a 1999 New York Times article where my predecessor, recently elected Kwasi Mfume, went to Hollywood. And because the opening of the television season that year, there were no Black leads at all in any of the comedies. And this is on the backdrop of some successful Black shows, Cosby Show, Family Matters, Different World. But by the time we got to 1999, it was a whiteout. And we established an office in LA to begin to address that. And you know, over time, we lost our way. It became an award show promotion as opposed to an advocacy place. Quite frankly, that's a long way to go. It is good to see the executives on the screen, and now we have executives in place to make decisions. But far too long, we were portrayed as one-dimensional characters on networks. Far too often, news outlets will have very narrow depictions of who we are, or it's a ping pong match. He said this, they said that, next story. And that is, they portray us as a monolith. As a community, we're not a monolith. We are very dynamic. And in the industry, I think the real advocacy is as much behind the cameras, decision makers. We still have news outlets that over-index what our communities watching, and there are no real decision makers in place to determine what's newsworthy, what content is appropriate or not. We have a long way to go. We've made progress, but I'm concerned with, if you come out of the late 80s, mid 90s, and all those successful African-American shows, you get to 1999 and it's a whiteout. Here we are in 2000. Progress needs to be forward moving, because we can find ourselves with a surge of depictions that look like America, only to get 5 years from now, go back to what it was.
No, totally. I know one of my concerns after Obama was no longer in office was that we would see fewer African Americans and people of color on television, because a lot of networks realized, like, oh, a Black man was elected president. Perhaps the country has moved forward in a different direction. We should open our minds to these projects that have been on the back burner, in some cases for decades, that people have been working on to bring to the forefront. And so it's been positive to see so many networks continue, like especially like Netflix, other networks who have really invested in diverse programming, but you want to see more of it, of course. So my next question
But I'd actually love to jump in on that.
Go ahead.
Because I think this is the thing that it's really important. One of the things most of us, some of us are not, are of a certain age on this call. And what that means is that we can actually remember the evolution of depictions of African Americans on television and in movies. I say this, I've been saying this all the time, which is, you know, Hollywood got the message when I was a kid back in the 80s that constantly casting Black folks as the robbers, thieves, drug dealers, murderers, et cetera, was a bad thing, right? And now when I watch a movie with my 9-year-old, it's amazing the lengths to which Hollywood goes to cast, you know, non-African Americans in every, you know, bad person role. But the reason why I share this is to say, And our dear friend Rashad Robinson at The Color of Change just recently did a piece of research that actually looked at the police procedurals and noted that one of the things is that there was not an overrepresentation of African Americans in the roles of criminals and what have you. So while it's true that Hollywood has evolved the depiction of people of color and reduced this kind of overrepresentation in these negative roles, the alarming thing is that hasn't correlated with the change of racism in this country, right?
Correct.
So what's important, I think, for us to understand is those depictions were reinforcing perceptions, but the journey now is to understand what we have to do to fundamentally combat perceptions, right? It's not enough to simply say we're not going to have negative depictions and or we're going to have positive depictions. Those two realities have been persistent for some time now, and they haven't actually addressed the underlying of racism, issues of racism in this country. So what we're working on is actually, it's one of the reasons why we're engaging academics, because this is not our area of expertise. We're engaging people who've actually studied racism and behavioral psychology and these other things to fundamentally understand what can be done to combat racism. What are the fundamental steps that we can take, the messages, the images that will allow us to counter the effect of racism? And so I just think it's important to note that there's been great progress in changing depictions over time. But it feels like to really move the needle in terms of how racism is affecting the country, we have to go that next step and say, what are the actual things that we can do to change perception?
Oh, that's I'm sorry, just to make this really quick. I think that you're absolutely right. I think the other question that we have to ask ourselves is, what standard are we holding Black content creators to, right? I think so often it is expected that Black content creators will come in and they will give us the story about race, right? And so that we're forcing them to write in contrast to racism versus just letting them be creatives and write. And so you take a show like clearly very successful for us, a show like Insecure, and ask ourselves, why is it that Issa's voice resonates so loudly? It's because she's not writing her show for white approval. Right. She's writing her show as a Black woman. And that's it. That's enough for her, right? We take a look at a show like I May Destroy You. It's not about a Black woman living in London, right? She's not writing about her experience. Clearly that comes into the story, but the story is driven by something else. And so I think the next step in this for us as people who greenlight content is to accept those stories when they come in. And it just happens, it's not the only Black family that lives in the neighborhood that makes the sitcom work. It is a Black family, period, end of discussion. And I think when we allow that kind of creativity, it will normalize the Black experience for audiences in a way that will affect change.
Great. So all this dovetails nicely into my next question, which I want to address to Kim, Scott, and Dennis. In what ways can we use our voices in the media as people who are content creators and producers to either inspire, calm, affirm people in this very stressful time? What can we do to help, produce a more nuanced message that's going to be rewarding for people of color and African Americans in particular?
I think there's a lot. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Scott. Go ahead, Scott. I'll go second.
And I'll be brief. I think the first thing is, and what's wonderful about the people who are participating in this panel is that we represent a really broad and diverse array of platforms. And that's really what's going to be critical to evolve and address the underlying issues here. We can't speak to one community. We can't speak to one segment of the population. We really need to speak to a broad cross-section, and we need to deliver tailored and relevant messages specifically to those populations, right? At Viacom CBS, we're having conversations. What's the relevant message for Nickelodeon to deliver to children? What's the relevant message for MTV to deliver to its audience, which is fundamentally different than the message that BET needs to deliver to its audience? So I think that's the first thing. But the other thing is, everybody on this Zoom is privileged to be a senior executive in organizations that have tremendous influence in corporate America and across media. And one of the things that we have to do is use our positions of leadership to engage a coalition of organizations that are capable of moving the needle. So we're having conversations. We don't have tech represented on this panel, right? But we're having at BET, and Derrick is as well, we're having conversations with some of the largest technology companies because they play a critical role in the distribution of messages, narratives, representations to all communities in this country. And you can't combat these issues if you don't have them as partners on this journey. So I think it's not just what we do with our own platforms, but how we use our presence and our influence to engage everybody else who has a relevant platform to really address this issue.
An exclamation point on that, Scott. One of the great things about this panel in itself is that most of us have been talking before today. Like, we've been collaborating already on these issues and talking to each other about how we make a difference. So that is a really, really great thing. And so for CBS, for news, as I said, you know, it's daily, it's all day, every day. So there's a tremendous weight that comes with that to, you know, make sure that we are really doing what we need to do to represent. One of the things that we did is we established a race and culture unit. Now, at first, I will tell you, I was not in favor of it. I was like, oh boy, sounds like putting Black people in a room and, you know, you all go do the Black stories. And I remember on a call with our president saying, oh, this sounds like Black History Month. I don't want to do that, you know, the race and culture unit. However, to Scott's point, and as we continue to talk, the president, Susan Zirinsky, was really, you know, into this idea. And I was like, okay, let me really think about that. Then I thought, hey, Kim, like, you're in charge of news gathering, right? So you can influence this process and accepting this idea. One of the issues we had at CBS were none of our news executive producers are of color. They're all white. And so this gave us an opportunity to put a Black executive producer over a unit. And one of the things that was very important to me, and then, you know, became very important to our executive team as we talked about it, is that this unit, the race and culture unit, is on the same level as standards and ethics at CBS. So race and culture is part of our standards and ethics. You cannot unlock the, you know, they are intertwined. And so he gets the same weight as every other story, every other approach to things or whatever. And it has been working. He is in every meeting. His team, we're building a team around him. It's a team of one right now, but, you know, it's going to be a team of bigger people. We're hiring for the unit, et cetera. But already there's been extreme impact because he's been in there to say, no, we have to do this. We forgot that voice. Hey guys, that's not quite correct. You know, we need deeper perspective on that. Hey, have you read the book before you say what, you know, all of that is happening, and that's a great thing. So, you know, putting money where your mouth is and putting things in action is important.
Kim, you sparked something that's just, I get incredibly passionate about, because it is too easy for us to default in moments like this to the Black History Month. What is we're gonna do for the cultural education program? Showing Black people, brown people, all people accurately, respectfully is that's job one, day in, day out, whether you're in the news business, whether you're in the entertainment business, or whether you're in the advertising business, right? And so, yes, we need to tap into the talents of our Black people at every level within our company, but we also have to take this moment to really educate everyone, allow them space to delve into their own biases, and then challenge the systems that will allow more holistic storytelling. So to go back to the points of, you know, when you have more diverse people behind the camera, in the writer's room, doing production, doing editing throughout that phases, you will get more holistic, more richer stories, not because it's a Black story, but because it's a true human story of everyday life in America. And so I just think that's such an important part of not defaulting back to committee-led thinking, but really saying, how does everyone come out of this? You know, Black people didn't create racism, right? And we're not going to end it ourselves. So we've got to bring people along with them, creating room for them to learn and grow, because that's just going to be critical for us to really use this and build on this moment that we find ourselves in.
Dennis,
yeah,
anything?
I would say that, you know, one of the challenges that we have in our industry is this sort of this idea that when stories come in the door, we typically judge them based on, you know, a gut reaction, right? Like, you know, is it good? Is this going to work for the network, et cetera? And that's sort of very standard and typical of entertainment, of Hollywood, right? So someone sits as the gatekeeper with like a very subjective point of view on what's good and what's not good. And as we know, people bring their own experiences into that room with them, right? I've often said that if you don't have anyone in the room who comes from a multi-generational Spanish-speaking household, when that script comes in the door and it says that the abuela lives upstairs and she speaks Spanish to her grandchildren, the person reading that script won't understand it in the same way that someone will who comes from that experience, right? So we can't trust that person's gut anymore. What I think we need, and what we're working towards at WarnerMedia, is systems that hold ourselves accountable. Our CEO has said that we count everything that's important in our company. Like that's how our business survives. We count subscribers, we count revenue, we count, you know, on and on and on. We have to get away from being afraid of saying there are not enough people of color in the room. But if it's important, we measure it. The other thing that I think is important is I was on a call recently with GLAAD, and Derrick, you mentioned this. We have to have the space to hold ourselves accountable and to advocate for the kinds of images that we see. On this GLAAD call, they released a report about LGBT representation in media, and they have this thing called the Vito Russo standard, right? So when this character shows up in the content, is it central to the storyline? If you remove that character, will the storyline be drastically different? Is the character there just for comic relief or for garnish? And if the answer to those questions is no, then it doesn't pass the Vito Russo test, right? I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what are the standards that we expect from the content that represents who we are and what our lives are about? If we don't put these systems in place of accountability, then I think, you know, Damon, you're right. Then we'll just default back to, you know, people getting an A+ because they programmed the month of February. And clearly that hasn't worked to this point, and it won't get us where we need to go.
And if I could jump in, Dennis, I think you raised a good point. The way GLAAD repositioned themselves to portray the LGBT community to the broader community led the way for marriage equality to be an accepted reality, led the way for policy change. Rashad, coming out of GLAAD, it kind of positioned in Color of Change to take on some of that. You know, one of the things we must do is figure out how do we depict the right images to move public policy. Because art is the forerunner of public policy, or public policy define art. Depending on what seat you're sitting in. And for African Americans, we've had such a rich history from whether it's civil rights movement, and we have to reframe that narrative from being a savior narrative. That's why I'm concerned with the deification of John Lewis, to looking at ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We all have that capacity and that ability, and what the true fight was about. Because the narrative has been so long about our struggle and our movement is about the speaker leader concept, the greatest speaker at the march, or the most charismatic personality. We are so much more dynamic than that. And we need to tell more dynamic stories. Who is the leader of the LGBT community? There are no leaders. There are many people who are a part of the community. That's who's leading it. Who's the leader of the African American community? All of us are the leader. And how do we help frame and shape a narrative to tell that story and not the savior mentality story?
I think this has been an incredible conversation, guys, especially about focusing on real tangible changes both brands and media companies can make in order to create a more equitable society, as opposed to, you know, just simple like declarations of Black Lives Matter. You guys are actually doing things that prove that you believe that Black Lives Matter, which I think is amazing. So we're gonna have to leave it there because we're running out of time. So I want to thank you all for joining us for this Paley Impact conversation presented by Citi. Thanks to BET and Scott Mills, and to our other special guests, Kim Godwin, Derrick Johnson, Damon Jones, and Dennis Williams. Be sure to support the Paley Center and consider becoming a Paley member by visiting paleycenter.org. Thank you all for joining us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Right.
It's a pleasure.